Good evening, Gamshi Lakwan, which is Kalapuya for What's Up and Greetings. I'm Mark Harris. I'm your host for DiversiTV, the weekly interview show broadcast on Lane TV. If you are new to DiversiTV, welcome. If you're part of our growing legion of fans, welcome back. DiversiTV's mission, and it's not impossible, we do choose to accept it, is to look at everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. Though tonight's guest does often get it, being in a position of governmental influence, shall we say. And we'll look at the season such as it is. Our seasons roughly correspond to LCC terms. So this is season 11. We've been going for nearly 12 years. And this season we've looked at, we usually start off, because we're on Turtle Island, with a Native American perspective. So Makrini Nikwash Mom is a Native American flute player. Last week we looked at the United Coalition of Color. I think this season seems to be shaping up to be looking at systemic and group type issues. Tonight we have County Commissioner Peter Sorenson. Before we get that, let me do a little bit of setup. When we look at issues of diversity as public policy, especially as applied to governmental or institutional organizations, Oregon is kind of like a southern state in the Northwest. So unlike southern states where non-whites were second-class citizens, non-white American citizens of other states in the United States were forbidden to come or remain in Oregon, though many did. Now, there's reasons for this. So, for example, there were individuals like Moses Harris, no relation, but who Moses Harris was, he led wagon trains of mostly white settlers, and his agenda as a black Indian, as we call him, because he came from South Carolina, was a trapper and also led wagon trains. And so one of the things he was trying to do was bring in more Americans so that the Oregon Territory would go to American hands rather than British hands. Wiley Griffin is the oldest historical African American, even though there were African Americans before him in the Eugene area. He's the first person mentioned in the historical record around the turn of the century. Eugene, before 1965, was kind of like a segregated southern town where blacks were not allowed to live within the city limits. They could be subject to arrest, sundown laws if on the street after dark, and were not allowed in many businesses, and this was posted. So there was an active Ku Klux Klan, which historically had roots within county and city governments, the Elks, American Legion, Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, and many other institutions, including the University of Oregon. So there was a need for a civil rights movement, and so we, pictures of Moses Harris, he's on the left there, and Wiley Griffin on the right. So while there were individuals like Moses and Wiley Griffin, while they were tolerated, even celebrated individually, no community of color was ever allowed to form geographically after 1949. Now, what happened before 49, Eugene, again, basically people were not allowed to go into many businesses and, of course, no churches. So this graphic of the Ferry Street Chapel, this is now St. Mark's Church. If you notice behind the group of women what that structure is, it's a wooden structure over a 20 by 40 army tent. This was their church because they weren't allowed to, worship in churches within the city limits, which then was basically the Willamette River was the boundary there. So Ferry Street, also known as Tent City, because there were sundown laws, people of color were subject to arrest. Residents of Ferry Street worked in town but crossed the bridge to live and play. Water was supplied by a garden hose. In addition to the chapel, there was a juke joint, a nightclub for you younger folks. Eventually, when the bridge was upgraded, Ferry Street Tent City was bulldozed before squatters' rights could be established, and that's why it was. And it's actually county commissioners who signed that law. And so, for example, this order to vacate, where basically it says, where certain persons are trespassing and remaining on said county-owned land without authority from the county court or anyone competent to give such authority, etc., you guys got to leave. So essentially, these are American citizens who are not being allowed, who can afford homes, but are not being allowed to live within the homes. So basically the law, for example, this is a land covenant. So 1946, establishing what's a form of discrimination called the redlining. So you can think of it as real estate apartheid. So these were legal until federal laws made them illegal in 1965. So number 4, no persons other than those of the Caucasian race shall own, use, lease, or any portion of said premises except if you're a domestic servant. So, for example, and that's the law, actually the bulldozing ordinance signed by County Commissioner Hurd, Christian Hurd, I believe. So, diversity is public policy. County commissioners were actually part of the Martin Luther King Jr. street renaming process, as well as the Sam Reynolds street renaming process. Then Commissioner Bobby Green, Commissioner Pete Sorenson, and Bill Dwyer were instrumental in that process, those processes. So when we look at diversity, so Pete Sorenson, my guest tonight, Lane County Commissioner representing South Eugene. He is an environmental lawyer, a lecturer and commentator on American politics. He's been an assistant in Congress and has worked for a presidential administration, served as a state senator, and has been an adjunct law professor. His formal education, program for America's emerging political leaders, the University of Virginia, JD, the University of Oregon School of Law, the Masters, University of Oregon Graduate School of Geography, a BA in Geography, I believe, University of Oregon, AA, Southwestern Community College, and graduate of North Bend High School. His prior public service is extensive. Volunteer prosecutor for the Lane County District Attorney, Lane County Democratic Central Committee, as well as being a state senator, legislator. Please welcome Pete Sorenson.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
In the interest of full disclosure, our kids went to school together. I'm a grandpa. We're about to be grandpas together, so we go back a ways, good 20 years. So where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Coos County, Oregon, and like you said, I went to North Bend High School and Southwestern Oregon Community College, and then I came up here to Eugene to go to the University of Oregon, and I kind of had 2 phases here. First was my undergraduate and graduate work, and that was in geography, and then I left and I got involved with Congressman Weaver. Ended up running his campaign, working for him in the U.S. Congress, living in Washington, D.C. And President Carter got elected, and I joined the Carter administration. But I got homesick and kind of tired of the big city, and I came back to Eugene to go to law school. So I've had 2 lengthy periods here in Eugene.
Yeah. So, in terms of a life in public service, how do you go from degrees in geography to what you do today?
Well, I actually got my interest in geography because I thought I was going to go into land use planning and an interest in how do we make communities livable, how do we make communities fair, what can we learn from the way other people in other parts of the world, how do they organize their transportation and land use. But that kind of led me into, well, there's different people living in different places, and that actually got me into voting patterns and how people in different parts of the world and in different parts of the United States, how do they vote. And that led me into what we call election geography, which then led me into, and my master's thesis that's in the U of O library is actually on Oregon voting behavior. So actually I kind of went from land use into people on the land, into voters who are people, into how do they vote, and that led me into working on and running political campaigns. Okay. So And then, of course, now as a Lane County Commissioner, I deal a lot with transportation and land use, so that's all been quite useful.
All that stuff is on the table these days.
And the legal background that I pursued, I think that's also relevant to what I do, because a lot of the issues are technical or legal. And I think ultimately just the whole process by which we make hopefully we make our society better, it should be a legal process, not an illegal process, not a violent process, but according to some rules.
I mean, it is often said we're a society of laws and that we try and run things by the rule of law. But that isn't often understood.
No, and I think that a lot of people don't realize that just because you make a law, just because you make a policy, it doesn't mean that that policy is going to be followed. And it's a careful balance between making a policy that's so far out in front of society that you know it won't be followed, versus a policy that might be followed, might be administered, might be actually implemented. And if you look at say, the topic of your series, you know, we've made incremental steps. And there's always people that have said, well, that wasn't fast enough. That wasn't good enough. We should have gone faster. And then there's other people who perhaps with hindsight go, well, you know, first we allowed white women to vote after we allowed white men to vote. Or first we allowed white men who didn't own property to vote. So we can back up to each example where we've made some progress, and yet there's always someone else to point out, well, wait a minute, is it really fair that this group cannot do this? Is it really fair, for example, a debate that's going on, is it really fair that people with different sexual orientation can't get married? Who made that rule?
Who made that rule?
You know.
So
I think each time there's always an opportunity, and as a lawyer, I've represented people on the vanguard, and now as a public official, I have a constituency, and I can be leading that constituency at times. I can be following that constituency at times. So I do see that over and over and over in history.
You raise an interesting point in terms of, you know, where people are now, what's considered mainstream, and then the vanguard, and how proud the vanguard is. I mean, I have been accused by a person, you know, who shall remain nameless, but I mean, I'm a public figure, they're public figures, so I've been accused of being stuck in, you know, the early 90s, when I'm thinking, no, I'm actually in the year 3000. You're stuck back somewhere, because I'm just thinking, you know, for example, with the sexual orientation issue. So these are American citizens, right? So by what right do American citizens not have the right to marry if there are other societies that would allow them to marry or have allowed them to marry? And by the way, what is marriage? Marriage is simply a means of transferring property, taking care of young children, elders, etc., upon succession. Well, that general container can hold a lot of different forms. So why not?
Sure. And I think each time you'll see that people can predict the future. In other words, I think, and here's my prediction for your show, I think we will get to a point in our society where we say, you know what, it's really wrong that people that are of the same sex can't get married. I'm ready to predict that. In other words, I see the development. First, you know, Karl Rove used in the 2004 election the strategy of exploiting Americans' attitudes about gay marriage, and put together a series of maybe 20 or 30 constitutional amendments in states, including Oregon, where the voters were, in my judgment, you know, influenced by their prejudices. They voted in these constitutional amendments. I want to say, of course, I opposed them. But I think that the voters are going to come to a point, and the American society is going to come to a point where they say, you know, we made a mistake. And I believe the Oregon voters will repeal that constitutional ban.
I mean, because corporate America and in some sections of governmental America, following suit with corporate America, have already done partner benefits, you know, domestic partnership benefits and things like that.
Sure. And by the way, our Board of Commissioners voted 3-2 several years ago to comply with a Oregon Court of Appeals ruling, which was brought in a case involving Oregon Health Sciences University. A gay couple sued Oregon Health Sciences University and said, wait a minute, you know, you're providing benefits to married people. We can't get married, but we have a sufficiently strong family bond that you shouldn't discriminate against us. And the Court of Appeals of Oregon, which is just below our Supreme Court, ruled that all government entities had to provide those benefits. Well, to give you an example, 3 of our 5 commissioners said, okay, we're going to comply with that law as it applies to Lane County government, but 2 said no. They're going to defy that law because their religious views...
I mean, it's a matter of popular record. On what grounds?
Yeah, well, their view was that, look, somebody has to force them to do it. They don't want to do it. Their politics, their belief system doesn't allow them to do it.
Okay. And you know, often it comes down to really a set of religious convictions, right? And so religion as public policy, I mean, to the degree that that's influencing that, because at one point the same justification for same-sex couples was applied to interracial couples, and was you know, when you talk about that whole chronology of first it's only rich white men, landowners, that get to vote, and then non-landowning white men get to vote, and then women, and then et cetera, everyone else after that. Yeah, well,
but not children.
Not children.
Children
right.
can't vote in our society, and we say, well, it's because when we established this idea that you had to be 21 or 18 to vote, it was thought that that children were not sufficiently mature. Right. And yet there's lots of science now that says that really children are mature.
They are mature.
And so we haven't adjusted that. So that's yet another vanguard where we would say, wait a minute, why did we do that? Why do we bar these people from not participating?
Are there thoughts, or is there science on how long it takes to catch up?
Well, I think, you know, this is way beyond, you know, my expertise, but what I have seen is that society moves forward slowly, then it moves backwards, then it moves forward, then it moves backwards a little bit. But ultimately, if, for example, just taking the area of voting rights, you know, we're moving forward. Yeah. We are doing better now than we did 50 years ago.
Yes.
We're doing, we did better 50 years ago than we did 200 years ago. So we're moving in the right direction. And incidentally, in Oregon, one of the issues isn't just you know, the right to vote. It's also making it easier to vote. And you know, with our vote by mail, I think we're getting more attention to the fact that in the election of 2010, in the primary, in the election of 2008, the tremendous victory Barack Obama had nationally, Oregon had the highest voter participation. And I think that we're seeing that people that are at home, people that are poorer, the elderly, people that can't get out as easy, you're seeing more and more voting, higher numbers of people voting. And I believe that other states will catch up and will say, well, it's better to have a system where more people can vote than a system where there are functional barriers to voting.
Right. One of your interests is in environmental law. Can you talk about what led you to that?
Yeah, I was raised in Coos County, Oregon, as I mentioned, and my dad was teaching at a high school in Myrtle Point, and we were living with another teacher and his family while we saved up enough money to buy a house. And so we're out in this really rural, not that Myrtle Point isn't rural, but really rural.
Really rural.
Right, and this is the town of Bridge, Oregon, which is, to show you, to illustrate how rural this is, it's 12 miles from remote Oregon. That's how rural Bridge, Oregon is.
Wow.
This is basically on the state highway between Roseburg and Coos Bay.
Okay.
Way out in the Coast Range. And Georgia Pacific was clear-cutting thousands of acres of old-growth Douglas fir trees in the 50s and 60s. And here I am, just a little kid swimming around my favorite swimming hole, and upstream is this giant clear cut that the following winter results in wiping out all this, what I later learned to be, fish habitat. But what I was mainly concerned about was my fish in my swimming hole.
Yeah.
And that is when it really dawned on me that there were environmental consequences to what we do.
Yeah.
And I would say it progressed to the point where after I worked in the administration in Washington and became an environmental lawyer, that I began looking at, well, what's the disproportionate impact of environmental problems on certain people?
Mm-hmm.
And I represented people all over the United States, and it's really the fact that disproportionate impact is on people of color,
yeah.
rural people, poor people, and the impacts of common forms of health degradation are also visited
right.
on the poorest people.
Right.
Even to the point where if you look at a map of Lane County and where the highest concentrations of carbon monoxide are in Lane County, they just are right over the poorest neighborhoods in Lane County. And so when I'm
factory emissions, wood smoke,
automobile and
okay.
truck emissions,
Okay.
for example, at the foot of the Washington Jefferson Bridge, right adjacent to the poorest neighborhood in really the whole 4th Congressional
right.
District, not
right.
even Lane County, just
right.
the whole, is the Whitaker area.
Yeah.
The school that they used to have there, the Whitaker School, now the Cesar Chavez School. That school area has the highest rate of food stamp eligible children.
Yes.
They are also the area with the highest concentration of carbon monoxide. And to give you an idea of how bad that is, that's about 400 times the state guideline for CO2 emissions.
Okay.
And so when I went on my big lecture tour after I got more known for doing safe drinking water litigation in particular, during the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations, a 12-year period, I would go to places like the Tulane University.
Okay.
And they had,
in New Orleans.
Right, in New Orleans. They would have a project involving the petrochemical industry and just where the emissions were most common. Poor, rural, white people, poor, rural, black people,
right.
And urban, poor, primarily black people in their part of the world.
Right.
You go up further in the northeast part, I spoke at the City University of New York. It's the only public law school in New York City, very poor. And, they're talking to me I'm talking to them about endangered species and salmon, and they're asking me questions. What can you do to abate, water pollution where the river's on fire?
The river is
on fire because of the amount of petroleum that's in that waterway. So really it's just a matter of common sense that if we use the environment as a big garbage can, it's the people that are poorest that live closest to the garbage can. Right. And that's really what it is. It's cross-cultural too. It's not it's really income based.
Yeah. I mean, we have the term environmental racism as if it's only on people of color, but really it's also about, class, about, poor, and even though the poor might be disproportionately of color, it's also affecting other folks.
Absolutely. By the way, in the rural parts of the West, you have also the issue of the Native American.
Right.
And they're living in arid areas, the lands nobody wanted. They're now relegated to these reservations. Oftentimes, it's environmental degradation adjacent to Indian reservations.
So what role does government play in alleviating that or abating that if it can?
Yeah, well, I think that this gets to the big national question that's before us and has been before us for a number of years in sort of the post-Reagan America, where we're grappling with what is an appropriate level of involvement of government. Do we want a government that is involved in every single aspect of our personal lives? Do we want a government that is involved with helping children? Where's the boundary between appropriate level of government?
Yeah.
And I clearly come down on the side of against the libertarian perspective, that the only reason we need a government is to not even have an army or a navy or a police department, because we could issue private letters of marque, like the Constitution allows a letter of marque to be issued to a private party.
Yes, right.
And by the way,
why don't you explain that?
Because
not everybody knows what that is.
For extra credit, I'll tell you, there's only one state that is allowed to issue a letter of marque under U.S. law. That's the state of Texas. They retained the right to issue letters of marque when they were readmitted to the Union. But a letter of marque and reprisal is a kind of a 1700s concept where you don't have enough of a navy to defend your country. So what you're going to do is you're going to issue a letter of marque and reprisal to the captain of a private vessel. And basically it allows them to function on your behalf, on behalf of whatever state issues the letter of marque and reprisal. And then they can go out and, shoot the other ship, take the other ship, steal all the stuff, and otherwise defend the sovereign that issued that letter of marque. Incidentally, Congressman Paul of Texas, the father of the Republican nominee from Tennessee for the Senate, he actually introduced a bill calling upon the Defense Department to issue a letter of marque in the Iraq War. It didn't get a hearing, but that's an example of a contemporary use of the concept.
It's still alive and kicking.
Still in there. It's in the Constitution, and in the Constitution of the state of Texas.
So, one of the many places I wanted to go, because you've occupied so many positions, as a legislator, as a lawyer, as a senator, county commissioner. There is a concept that I learned of in my doctoral studies called, I took a class called the psyche of law from Horowitz. And basically, he says in the psyche of law, there's what's called original position. And part of what original position is what were they thinking when they made a law? Like, what's the problem? How is the law that you're writing creating a solution? What other problems does the law create in implementation, and then how do you do those fixes? So in those contexts, to form this state, for example, it wasn't simply slavery that they were trying to outlaw, or basically, when Oregon was forming as a territory, it wasn't simply you had to decide which way you're going to go on the slavery question. It's how they did it. And how they did it was saying, okay, free black people can't come here. And so, for example, to quote Representative Thurston, basically the reason you're banning free black people is because they mix with Indians, and because black people have a superior knowledge of white European culture, they can teach the Indians how to become better in battle tactics, and the Indians will be revolting. Well, I mean, the Indians know how to revolt all by themselves, really. But that was interesting. But you had people like Moses Harris coming here saying, no, we want more Americans because we want Oregon to be part of America, so that seems counter to that. So part of the pieces about, we have this, it's created a lingering climate that we've been forced to deal with. Like you talked about the kind of monocultural of Coos County, right? How there were basically 1% minority, and then you move back to D.C. and it's a different environment, right? So a lot of times when we're dealing with diversity as public policy, there's sort of in the DNA this form of discrimination that we're like slowly eradicating and coming out in the vanguard of. So we have interesting things here in Oregon where we have advanced environmental laws with the whole bottle bill under McCall, et cetera, and recycling and clean air, clean water, and, the environmentals battling the loggers and the spotted owl kind of thing. But, when they talk about diversity, diversity becomes a stickier question.
Absolutely. And, I actually look at this issue of diversity in the same sense that we might think about it in the world of biology or ecology, that your ecosystem is going to be stronger if you have greater biological diversity. And I take that concept and I think about it in the concept of cultural diversity. That in the community I grew up in, 60,000 people in Coos County in 1960. Non-white population about 1%. White population about 99%. Now, I'm not dismissing the role of the Chinese to help build the railroad, or the American Indians that were there first, or the African Americans who came through to be in the Coast Guard or in the Air Force, and that's dominantly how a lot of the African American people that were there came through. So I'm not dismissing their contributions, but to put it out there, 99% is a pretty big number. And then when I moved to D.C. and I go into a city of 800,000 people where the non-white population is in the vicinity of 96%, that's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
And a lot of people don't have that experience. They've had one of those experiences, but not both. And so I think it's helped me. And the other thing that's helped me, I think, is to realize that it's not also, it's easy to stereotype and say, well, this person's white, this person is Native American, this person is Chinese, this person's Korean. But you know what? We're getting more and more integration to where the other day I was talking with someone at my house. We were talking about one of the projects we're working on, and she says, maybe it's that little bit of Cherokee in me that, and I'm thinking, wow, this is, I hadn't thought about that. But you're going to see more and more of that and I think it just is a better way to live, to go, wow, this is a person that has an experience that I just have never had. I mean, you grew up in Baltimore. I mean, that's an experience that I'm never going to have. And the closest thing I'm going to really get to it is maybe going there, maybe talking with you, maybe getting to know you. So I kind of view the diversity as a strength, that we ought to be embracing it. We ought to be really open to it. We ought to be actually doing what we can to break down the barriers that don't allow us to experience that diversity. And certainly in Eugene in 2010, which is a lot different than the Eugene that I moved here.
In 83. Oh, I moved here in 83.
So I moved here in 73, about a decade before you. So in the time I've lived here, it's gotten better. Again, it's, as we discussed earlier, it's gotten better. But think of how much better it could be if we had a real respect for and embracing that diversity. And this is one of the reasons why I'm here to talk about it. And how can we make that, in my current role as a Lane County Commissioner, how can we make that real? So it's not just, a politician saying we ought to do it. How do we actually make tangible steps towards that? How do we actually improve?
So to bring part of our off-camera discussion, not tonight, but before, because just to set some ground rules so people know, I'm very mindful of legal issues, et cetera, et cetera. We're not discussing personnel or any of that kind of, no lawsuits, et cetera. We're talking about policy in general, right? Because part of the things that happen, when we're talking about environmental racism, we're talking about, the guests on the show last week were, working on DMC as an issue, disproportionate minority contact. So that's a species, at least in communities of color, where we characterize it as a form of institutional racism. Now, when you mention the R word, people start freaking out. I mean, it's uncomfortable. And
why do you think that is? Why do people, given the history of racism that's existed, and I'm not talking about worldwide, I'm talking about in the United States.
Right, in the United States.
In our lifetime.
In our lifetime.
Not like
right.
way, way long ago,
Right.
but right now, and looking back in our own lifetimes, why would anyone be sensitive about a word like racism that accurately describes what it is we've experienced?
Well,
I have my own view. I'll tell you.
Go for it.
I was running for the state senate. I was appointed to the state senate. So I was a state senator when this happened to me. And I had put an ad in, I think it was the Emerald, for an intern to help me on my campaign. So this is about the summer of 1994. Again, we're not talking, back in the olden days.
No.
We're talking about within a conversational memory.
Yes.
Okay. And there was a English professor named, I believe his name was Garrett Hongo.
Okay,
and he
right.
wrote an article
Right.
in the LA Weekly about racism in Eugene. And I remember hearing, not about his article, because I don't read the LA Weekly, but I remember it was written up in some, maybe the Register Guard, maybe in the Eugene Weekly, that it was now controversial
Right.
that he had done this.
Right.
So meanwhile, I'm putting this ad in the paper. Needed one intern, pay zero, experience great, and would you like to help me run for the state senate? So this young guy calls me up, and he's from Honolulu, and he's going to the U of O, and he says, by the way, I have to do this thing for my class, and I'd like to work with you. So he's this young Chinese guy from Honolulu, raised in a Chinese family in Honolulu. He moves to Eugene, and he starts helping me. We're driving through Whitaker. He's driving the car. He's pulled over. I'm in the car with him.
Yeah.
And you see, normally, I am not pulled over
Right.
when I'm driving in Whitaker.
Right.
So this is a first for me. And then after the officer lets us go, I ask him, I say, hey, does this happen? He says, I don't really drive that much, but a lot of the other friends of mine say, yeah, it pretty much happens all the time.
Yeah.
And you mentioned I was a prosecutor in the DA's office.
Yeah.
Well, I also spent some time as a defense lawyer.
Yeah.
And the phrase that's used by a lot of criminal defense lawyers is driving while Hispanic.
Yes. Right.
That the officer pulls the person over based upon the race or perceived race of the driver.
Right.
And that's not allowed.
Right.
That's not allowed.
Right.
And I think that this is why when I hear people say, well, I'm nervous when I hear the word racism, that they either haven't experienced these things, and look, come on, I'm a 59-year-old white guy. I'm not really the poster boy for experiencing these things.
Right.
But I have experienced these things
Yeah.
at pretty close proximity.
Yeah.
I've also gone door to door and knocked on the door, and at the end of the conversation with the voter would say, oh, by the way, who's the Chinaman? Because they weren't used to having a person of color knock on their door.
As an intern
Right.
to a senatorial candidate. Right.
So these are just tiny things. And so that's why I can only imagine what a Professor Ed Coleman has gone through in his 60 years in Eugene. I just can't even imagine it.
Yeah.
And so that's why you mentioned at the top of the program that I testified in favor of changing the name of Centennial Boulevard to Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, we need to have some symbols before we can really take the action. We need the symbols so that we can help people understand that we want to overcome this racism.
Yeah. And then, then once the symbols, I guess, you got to stake the territory in the vanguard, and then you have to also have substance to pave the road.
Right.
So, as an example, to answer your question from that point of view, so why are people, uptight about the R word, right? They think that you're calling them personally racist, often. And without necessarily understanding that institutional racism doesn't mean that you personally are racist, because it might mean that you might be carrying out a policy that unconsciously that is replicating your training. So in my driving while black stop, in 1984 in Whitaker, I got stopped by a white lesbian cop. Now, she experienced discrimination, as a woman, and because of her sexual orientation. But she said that her training at the police academy basically said, okay, she didn't see me as, a master's degree holding drug counselor working for Whitebird, even though I'm wearing my Whitebird t-shirt and I'm coming back from a Whitebird softball game. She just saw, black man, beat her car, Whitaker. Oh, you must be one of the recent parolees from OSP. And so I'm going to, she asked me for my ID, and I give her, how many times have you ever been arrested? And I go, yeah, I was arrested once when I was 17. She goes, 17 arrests? No, I was arrested once when I was 17. What was that for? Theft? Okay.
And I think that what you're getting to is that in dealing with people in power, until they can recognize and understand that there has been racism and that racism does exist, it's hard for them to get away from the personal. Now, for me, I'm not a poster boy for understanding racism, but I do believe that education can help people, and I don't mean just formal education. What was it Mark Twain said? Don't let the schooling interfere with the education.
Right.
But I do think a certain amount of structured education about the history of different types of people in the United States, whether it is the Native Americans, maybe it's the Japanese and the Japanese Americans in World War II, maybe it's the experience of the other Asian immigrants, particularly the Chinese, but maybe the Laotian and Vietnamese in more contemporary history. Certainly the entire horrible history of slavery and the Reconstruction, so that people have some idea, and maybe even something a little more easier for white people to understand, just the treatment of the Irish and the Italians and other immigrant groups that they might be able to identify more directly with. But until they get some basic understanding of how people are treated, and this is why I think it's great what you've done locally with the information about some of the the Assemblyman, the Thurston and his quotes and the Wiley Griffin and all this. To me, that's helping people understand it in the context of place. But I really think a certain amount of the more formal education is really important. But then I think it's also a matter of, okay, I understand the basics of that. What can I do now? What can I do now to deal with disproportionate minority contact by the Eugene Police Department, by the Springfield Police Department, by the Lane County Sheriff's Office, by the Oregon State Police? What about disproportionate charging by the prosecutor? What about disproportionate sentences by the courts? If people aren't aware of these statistics, if they're not aware of this, it's going to be hard for them to find solutions to the problem.
And that's often one of the challenges, especially as a minority professional, trying to say, look, I'm not calling you racist, but I'm saying, look, even if I am on a first-name basis with Alex Gardner or Doug Harkleroad, I worked with Doug on the gang task force. So, for example, okay, look, you guys, if 80% of the gang members are white kids in what you used to call black-style gangs, but since it's 80% white, you can't call it black-style gangs anymore. It's, LA style. Well, that's no different. So, no, they're here in Oregon, and they're acting out. So, y'all need to figure out why these middle-class white kids want to act like black gangsters, right? That's one. So, I can talk to Pete, right, the current police chief, because I knew him since he was a sergeant, and say, all right, listen, this officer, here you have these 20 kids in this house, they're smoking pot, they were making noise, that's why the officer was out there, but you only give the black kid the ticket for pot. What, did you run out of tickets? So, yeah, and here's a single black kid in, a car full of white kids. They all get tickets, but only the white kids get treatment. The black kid gets jail.
I do have a suggestion, because I think one way, and again, I realize I'm fitting somewhat of a stereotype of people that are in authority.
Yeah.
Even if I have different views from a lot of them, but I realize that my imagery comes off that way. But one thing I do think is a great suggestion that has been made to me on more than one occasion, and that is, if you keep going back to inquiry, if you keep asking the questions, it's really the other person that may get defensive.
Yeah.
They may get defensive, or they may say, I really don't know. We should find that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do know, here's what I think.
Yeah.
Or I don't have specific information, but here's what I do know. I think that sometimes the going to the inquiry and going to the heart of what you're concerned about, because you're not really concerned that the police are over-ticketing a particular type of activity. No. What you're really concerned about is when they do make the decision to cite someone, are they really making that in the most color-blind way possible? Right. And are their officers trained and are their supervisors trained to be alert to disproportionate behavior?
And then when those kids get into another part of the system, the juvenile department, okay, so kid was cited, and what are you going to do about it? Right. Is the kid getting treatment? And then is the kid getting effective treatment? Is treatment effective? Right. That particular, for anybody?
And is there modeling for that kid? Are they seeing people that they can relate to? Right. So the issue of how do we diversify the workforce?
Exactly.
How do we encourage and model recruitment? And probably more significant than recruitment, in my opinion, is retention.
Right. That's
because
a very critical piece.
We can recruit people and have that that drug counselor that looks more like the people that they'd be comfortable with, and could be a role model for them. But if we can't retain them, that becomes a real issue.
I'll tell you,
that
definitely becomes.
I have a personal story on that too. The U of O Law School had a African American woman as a professor when I was in law school, and she was a phenomenal teacher. And she said, "Well, next year I'm not going to be here." And I was talking with her. I said, "Where are you going?" She goes, "I'm going to the University of Georgia. They're offering me twice as much money, and my husband can find a place to work."
Yeah.
I've been trying for 2 years to help my husband get a job, and he can't find a job. And so what I'm going to have to, and plus I'm offered more money. Now, in my view, she left. She went to the University of Georgia. I tell you, I didn't make that same mistake when I was a county commissioner, and the sheriff had hired an African-American man from Riverside to be the jail commander. And I went over to his office and I said, "What does your wife do?" He says, "She works for the post office. We're hoping she can find a job here." I'm telling you, Mark, I made like 40 phone calls to every post office within 50 miles of Eugene, because without his wife getting transferred, the likelihood of him staying as jail commander, which is a really important job, and in fact, I tell you, as a ex-criminal defense lawyer, it's the most important job if you're in jail. If you're in jail. So, I mean, to have a person, a professional with law enforcement and corrections experience, to come to this community, but then not have the spouse be able to find a job. The vulnerability to him, we recruited him. He was the top candidate from a national search. But we might have lost him had his spouse not been able to find a job here.
And if you don't, so the co-hiring piece in terms of diversifying is really, really critical. So the retention piece, let's talk about that in terms of, all right, so you get him in place, and he's like a pioneer or whatever. And so if we don't have to necessarily use law enforcement. We can use other parts of county government. So,
and by the way, it's fair to say, in my experience, having been a state senator and looking at all these public employers, and you compare one to the other, you know, LCC is ahead of Lane County as an employer, for example.
Yeah.
And having been on the board at Lane Community College and having been on the board at the county, I can see that. And I can see that there were actual structural changes made at Lane to be better.
Right, right.
And again, we're back to better compared to what.
Compared to what.
But
yeah, right.
better, in this case, than, say, Lane County.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that is modeling. Part of that is promotion, because you get someone in place and you don't give them authority. And if they feel ostracized and their spouse isn't finding a job in the community, then things are going wrong. Things are going in the wrong direction. But if you do a better job in your retention of promotion, if you do a better job in terms of being aware of their family situation, you're a lot more likely to actually keep that person. And by the way, look at it from a taxpayer standpoint. Do you really want to spend the time and money to have to go out and then do another national search for a top position? Do you really want to do a regional search? Do you even want to do a local search for a lower position? Yeah. And I think the taxpayer answer is no. You want to retain the person. That's a more cost-effective way of dealing with it.
Yeah. So for me, it's not so much just the question of what constitutes culturally competent government, if we were to use that term. So you attract, and part of the attraction is also doing good retention. That means you might have to defend them against some people who are going to be hostile to their brand of being on the vanguard, especially if they're a skilled person. Because that's one of the things I've found in terms of resistance. It's like, all right, yeah, you've hired the right, you've done color matching, you've done the role modeling piece, and the person is skilled within their discipline, and they're a little bit of an innovator. But that means that that's going to be threatening to some folks.
Well, and there's a risk, too, that the kind of person that would come in as a vice president or a manager or a department director or a division manager, and they're going to come in, there's a risk that they actually won't be innovative, that they'll be wanting to keep their head down in the foxhole and not attract attention. And that's not what you want. You want leaders.
You want leaders.
So there's a risk of having a person that, well, you know, I got this great job, things are going really good. The last thing I want to do is rock the boat. And see, from a standpoint of social change and having a government that really serves people, and to think about eWeb and Springfield Utility District and Lane Community College and the U of O and the City of Eugene and 4J and Springfield School District and Lane County.
All the IDEC people.
All of these people, you want leaders. You want people that are willing to push the envelope. And I can't even imagine, you can, but I can't even imagine the pressure to conform. So I think you're raising a really good question of how are you not only going to support that person and hire that good person and retain that good person, but then support them when they try to exert some leadership.
I mean, that's
true of women as well as people of color.
Right. It's definitely true. So, is it possible within limits to prune some bad apples from the tree?
I think that one of the things you have to do is you have to be aware that this is a carrot and stick dimension, meaning that you will not solve this problem entirely with carrots. By saying, gosh, you know, we really believe in diversity, and we send our commissioners to DiversiTV, and we talk about how important diversity is. Well, what changed at the end of that hour? What changed? And I think that having a carrot of, well, we're going to have a better affirmative action program, we're going to have a better outreach, we're going to advertise in other types of publications than we normally do, we're going to actually get the word out, we're going to maintain an email list, we're going to really get the word out for these positions. Well, that's all great, but what about, you know, a department of a particular government where a court has adjudged them for violating someone's civil rights? Does their department manager get promoted?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and so that becomes the stick part of it. And I personally, very occasionally, I don't advertise this much, but occasionally I will actually, in my role as a commissioner, come down on an administrator, a department director, where there has been more than one example of not really following the golden rule.
Right.
And having someone in a position of power to say, the next time you come in with an allegation like that, I'm just going to spend my time trying to get 2 other commissioners to get you out of here. I'm not going to spend any more time on any more diversity trainings and any more hand-holding sessions and anything like that. It's going to be, you're out. So sometimes, and by the way,
we're going to have to leave it at that.
Okay,
because
sorry.
we have less than a minute to credits. But
well, it's great to be here, Mark.
thanks
Thanks.
you for coming. If you like what you've seen, email us at DiversiTV, DiversiTV in the subject line, a live class at lanecc.edu. Tell a friend, and go well, stay well. That was good.
Yeah, thank you.